Okay, so we're going to continue on with our discussion about economic dominance and how the U.S. got to be where it is, and we're going to do that by looking at big business. So far we've looked at government involvement in the economy, and we've looked at kind of how workers have changed over time. But we also need to look at business and how has that helped our country grow into what it is today. So your essential question that you're going to need to deal with, big picture question, you're going to want to put this in your notes, whether you're writing them or typing them, is what does big business in America look like? When did big business come to power? Why did big business come to power? And do you think large corporations help or hurt the economy? Okay, so this presentation is just the first part of a series of activities that we're going to do to help you be able to answer that question. Make sure that you take good notes. You're going to need to pause this often and to write things down. And the notes aren't just going to be what's on the paper or what's on the screen. You're going to need to listen to what I'm saying, pause it, and write down what the important parts are. So before we get into kind of where we're at and how we got here, let's just kind of sort of try and define a couple of terms here. First of all, big business, which is a really vague sort of a term. It can mean different things depending on how it's used. But for our purposes, we're basically means large companies. When we talk about them sort of as a group, these large companies or big business are in charge, running the economy or employ a lot of people or cause a lot of problems or help the economy. There's lots of different ways you might hear this used. Or it also could be, in a more specific sense, an activity or product that made a large amount of money. So think some sort of big economic activity, whether that's collectively or whether that's individually. And then corporation is an association of individuals that exist, and it's sort of a vague term. You guys are familiar with corporations. Most companies are corporations, but the idea is that you own a piece of an entity, a business, or some other form of organization, and that business goes on independent of the existence of its members. So stock holders are the members of a business or a corporation. You buy the stock, but when you die, the corporation continues on. The ownership piece that you have, your stock, can be transferred from one person to the next, which is different than a business owned by an individual that has to be transferred from one person to the next. Think of a family business. If your parents owned a business, they would have to sell it or give it to someone else. Where a corporation goes on, just doesn't matter who owns the stock, they go on independent of that. The stockholders have a vote, and they have some say in how the business is run, but if a stockholder dies, it doesn't impact the business too much. They just sell the stock to someone else. And we'll talk more about what that means and what the implications are for what we're talking about a little bit later. So kind of start out where are we at today. If you don't know this, business is regulated. The size of business, how much one company or one corporation or a group of companies can own of a particular industry or a particular field. So monopolies and trusts, and I'll define those a little bit later, are legal and or regulated. So in some cases they can exist, but they have to have government regulation. We have federal laws that enforce how big businesses can be. And they are enforced really by two main departments. The Department of Justice has an antitrust division, and that's for criminal enforcement, so they can actually put people on trial or break companies up. The Federal Trade Commission also has more of a civil, which has to do with money and not jail time, a civil division that deals with how to regulate business. States also have their own laws on how to regulate the size of businesses, but they differ from state to state, so we're not going to get into them. But what you need to understand, and I'll give you some examples to read about and some things to look at later, but for now you need to know businesses are regulated, and then they're regulated by the size they can be is regulated by the Federal Trade Commission, which you'll also hear referred to as FTC, and by the Department of Justice. So a good example of this would be if two companies in a particular industry want to merge or consolidate. Sometimes if they're big companies, they'll have to get approval from the Department of Justice and the FTC. An example of that would be AT&T and T-Mobile wanted to combine, 2 phone companies wanted to combine, and they had to get approval from the Department of Justice and the FTC because they would control too much of the market, and the government would say that it would hurt competition. And we'll talk about what that means a little bit later. So how did we get here? And this is kind of the historical background of how we got big business and how we got to regulation. So right after the Civil War is over, the northern part of our country becomes the largest industrial area in the world, the most factories, the most production. We see a kind of a convergence of changing of technologies along with some really shrewd entrepreneurs who make a lot of money for themselves. So we're going to look at kind of the big 4 here. Big 4 would be railroads. Railroads are really the first large corporation or the first big business because as we talked about with the expansion westward, the Transcontinental Railroad, moving goods around the countries from the newly created factories, moving goods from the north to the south to help rebuild the south, moving goods from the east to the west, and moving raw materials from the west to the east, as well as moving people around the country, becomes hugely important. So kind of 2 inventions that sort of help the railroads become popular. The Pullman Car Company creates sleeping cars and traveling cars. These are like the railroad cars that people ride in, and that is really important because it makes it easier for people to ride on cars and more comfortable, so people are more likely to travel. And the Westinghouse air brake makes it safer for trains to stop, makes it a little bit easier and quicker and more reliable for trains to stop. So those 2 things, you kind of put those together and you get an increase in safety and an increase in comfort, and rail travel becomes increasingly popular. So what happens when you own a railroad? Well, when you own a railroad, you realize that you own the piece of track that you have and you don't own anything else. And you realize that you're kind of competing with other people that own railroads. So what these companies decided to do was they would form pools, which were voluntary groups that would get together and say, okay, we're all going to charge this same price. In today's world, that might be called a cartel, but back then they called it a pool. And so everybody's going to do that. What it does is decreases competition, which means, okay, well, now my railroad and your railroad charge the same price, so we don't need to compete with each other. And it increases profits because they would make the prices higher than what they would have before. So one guy in particular, Cornelius Vanderbilt, who I had you guys look up earlier, he comes up with this sort of idea of buying as much railroad as he can, increasing the size of these pools, and he kind of eventually owns most of the railroads in the country. So he becomes increasingly large. The railroad structure becomes increasingly profitable, and this becomes sort of the first big business that this guy becomes the equivalent of a billionaire in today's world. The one thing to note about railroads is that it really hurt farmers. It led people to leave the farms because of the increased prices. Basically, the railroad said, if you want to get your crops to market, where you have to pay us whatever we want, and farmers couldn't do anything about it. So it became so expensive for small farmers to ship their stuff that a lot of them left the farms and moved into the cities to work in factories. So that kind of ties into what we've already talked about. But we'll talk a little bit more about farmers later. Second major big business we talk about is the steel industry. And the steel industry is really important because it builds the railroad. They take iron ore and they make it into steel, which is much stronger. It's lighter than what iron would be by itself. And it's later, after it builds the railroad, after the steel industry helps to build the railroad, they also are able to help build cities, build buildings taller and larger. So there's lots of demand for steel. Andrew Carnegie comes along, and his innovation in the steel industry is the Bessemer process, and he brings that over from Europe. He's from Scotland, and this makes the Bessemer process allows them to create steel cheaper and faster. So he's able to undercut the price of other steel mills, and he's able to increase the quality. And by doing that, he becomes more profitable, and he eventually expands, and he owns most of the steel industry at one point. So he basically creates a monopoly in the steel industry. The steel industry is very difficult for workers, low pay, lots of hours, and like we talked about a little before, it's kind of one of the reasons why people begin to unionize. So his thing was vertical integration, and if you taking notes, you need to make sure you're writing down some of these terms. But vertical integration is the idea that you buy all the companies up and down the supply chain. So if you're not familiar with the supply chain, the idea is that you have certain things that you need to make your product. So in his case, he needed raw materials like iron ore to make his product. So the supply chain is everything that you need to buy to make your product. So when you integrate vertically, you buy all the sources, all the raw materials. And for Carnegie, that meant owning the steel mills, and that meant owning where the steel came from. So he bought a lot of iron ore, he bought the suppliers, and he was able to control the whole process from raw material to final product. And he was able to make more money that way. Third one that we're going to kind of touch on would be banking and JP Morgan. He basically starts the corporation makes money off of corporations. And so what happens is all these corporations, as they grow, guys like Carnegie and Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, these big companies that are growing, they borrowed money from the banks so that they could finance their operations. And when they paid these banks back, because they're making money, the bank makes huge amounts of money. And JP Morgan becomes the richest guy in the country. At one point, he actually he buys out Andrew Carnegie, who was the richest guy in the country, and buys most of the steel industry. He invested in railroads, and to some extent buys out Vanderbilt. So he single-handedly becomes sort of the biggest of these big business guys. And kind of an example of that is there was a business panic in 1893. The economy was struggling, people were afraid, and they were taking all their money out of the banks. And back then, the money in the bank was backed by gold. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but there's the idea of the gold standard, and you had to have so much gold in reserve for how much money you had, and the U.S. government literally was running out of gold. And if we wouldn't have had gold, we wouldn't have been able to meet our obligations. So it would have been like default or bankruptcy. So in 1894, Morgan single-handedly saved the government with his personal money. He gave the government $129 million worth of gold, which back then would have been like billions and billions of dollars today. So he becomes so rich that he could single-handedly bail out the U.S. government. And so it's kind of what we're talking about with big business is sort of these guys are so big that they can kind of control things. Last one we're going to talk about is Rockefeller, which was oil. He owned Standard Oil Company. Oil was discovered in Pennsylvania. The thing about oil was it was only valuable when it was refined. So you had to do something with it. Raw oil didn't do anybody any good, and Rockefeller realized that. So his business, Standard Oil, owned all the refineries in the oil industry. So he owned 90%, 95% of the refining capacity. So if you had oil, it didn't matter unless you gave it to him or you sold it to him. He did some pretty unique things, but one of them was to create trust. And what he did was he would take all the other companies, he owned multiple companies, and he would have those companies organized into a trust. And a trust was like the earlier version that we talked about with pools, except for it was legally binding. So each company in the trust had to give their ownership vote to this trust, and then the trust managed all these companies. So essentially they were all separate companies, but they would work together because they were managed by a single group of people in a trust. And when they were managed by a single group of people, that means that they all had the same interest and nobody was competing with each other. So he creates a monopoly through using this trust system. And he has 95% of the oil refineries capacity in the U.S., which is an example of horizontal integration. So instead of buying the raw material, which in his case would be oil, which would be down his supply chain, he goes across, and he actually owns all the oil refineries. So it doesn't matter who owns the oil. If you want it refined in the United States, you have to go through him. And if you want to buy refined oil, back then it was mostly kerosene, heating oil, lamp oil, that type of stuff. You had to go through him. And if you're a railroad company and you wanted, his business, you had to pay. He could basically tell you, this is how much I'm going to pay you to ship my stuff, or I'll go with a different railroad company. So he was hugely powerful. Other kind of big businesses from that era are meatpacking, retail stores, later the auto industry and other manufacturers. But during that time period, those are kind of the main ones that the history books talk about. Okay, so these companies grow so big, and they're doing a lot of unethical things. They're firing people that they don't get along with. They're making a lot of enemies. They're making money, and everybody knows that they can do whatever they want. And so basically the idea is the government becomes sort of afraid of them, and they realize that they have too much power in the economy, and they have too much power to be able to influence politicians. So they try and regulate these big businesses. In 1887, the Interstate Commerce Act is set up to regulate the railroad. And it says that anything that passes from one state to the next, anything that crosses state line, the federal government can regulate. In 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act is passed, which basically says trusts are illegal. The problem is it was weak and pretty much ignored. In 1914, and a couple of other acts are passed to kind of strengthen things. The Clayton Antitrust Act is sort of to reiterate or strengthen the Sherman Antitrust Act, and the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914 gives the FTC power to regulate the size of businesses if they become too close to a monopoly or too large. So kind of a couple of historical figures that are involved with regulating big business would be Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th president of the U.S., and he was wildly popular, huge personality. He was a war hero from the Spanish-American War, and he used what he called the bully pulpit, which meant he would get up in front of people, he would speak. He was a very good speaker, very powerful, and he'd get up and he'd just explain, this is what we need to do. He'd get people all fired up, people would support him, and then he'd go to Congress and say, okay, I got everybody behind me, now you need to do this. And so one of the things he does is he kind of revived the Sherman Antitrust Act, and he starts bringing lawsuits through his government against companies that were engaged in creating trust. And he actually breaks up Standard Oil, which is Rockefeller's company, which was under the Northern Securities name, but Rockefeller's main company he breaks up. But the thing with Roosevelt is he gets a lot done, but he talks a lot more than he gets done. So he talks a big storm, he gets some stuff done, but it was less action and it was lots of talk. So it was like everybody was really popular because he could get up there and say, this is what we're going to do, and he could get everybody fired up, but he didn't actually get as much stuff done as what you would think. The next president, William Taft, is kind of the opposite. So you need to know about him is he was a weaker personality. He didn't like to talk in front of people. He didn't like to convince people. He's kind of the behind-the-scenes guy, but he actually accomplished more. But between Taft and Roosevelt, we see that the big business kind of get brought back to size and sort of under control. So you don't have these, larger-than-life figures that are running huge portions of the economy that are kind of dictating whatever they think is necessary. So that kind of brings us back to where we're at today. We're going to look at how different regulations affect companies, when they can merge, when they cannot merge, what has to happen, in some of the lawsuits that we see in today's world. So if there's any of that you missed, make sure that you go back, re-listen, pause, retake notes. There will be a short quiz over this that you'll have over the next couple days. You'll be able to use your notes, so if you need to make them any better, please do so.